The billionaire CEO had seen thousands of names on employment applications, but when her eyes landed on one particular name, the color drained from her face. Her hand stopped halfway across the page, and for several seconds, she couldn't breathe. The name belonged to a man she had spent 20 years believing was dead. But the person standing outside her office wasn't a ghost from the past. He was a tired single father holding a janitor application in one hand and his 8-year-old daughter's lunchbox in the other. Before we begin, if you believe people deserve kindness, second chances, and that one small act of compassion can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose heart might need a story like this today. It was a cold Monday morning in Chicago, Illinois, when 38-year-old Matthew Bennett walked through the revolving doors of Bennett Hart Industries. He had worn the same dark jacket for nearly 4 winters, and although he had carefully washed and ironed it that morning, the sleeves were beginning to fray. In his hand was a folder containing his resume, a few certificates, and a handwritten letter explaining why he desperately needed the job. Matthew wasn't looking for a career. He wasn't asking for a miracle. He simply needed enough money to keep a roof over the head of his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. 2 years earlier, Matthew's wife, Rebecca, had died unexpectedly after a long illness. Her death left him with grief, unpaid bills, and a little girl who still sometimes woke up at night calling for her mother. Matthew had worked construction whenever he could find it, delivered groceries on weekends, repaired broken fences for neighbors, and even cleaned offices after midnight. But work had become harder to find, especially after a back injury forced him to leave construction. That morning, Sophie had hugged him before school and whispered that she didn't want to move again. Matthew had smiled and promised her they wouldn't. But after she left, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at an overdue rent notice. He knew he had one chance left. The janitor position at Bennett Hart Industries paid modestly, but it offered steady hours, health insurance, and something Matthew desperately needed: stability. He arrived 20 minutes early and sat quietly among other applicants. Some wore expensive suits. Others had polished resumes. Matthew looked down at his worn shoes and wondered whether he had made a mistake. Then his name was called. A human resources manager named Claire Morrison collected his application and carried it upstairs to the executive floor. She placed the papers into a stack on the desk of the company's CEO, Victoria Bennett. Victoria was 45 years old and one of the most successful businesswomen in the country. She had built Bennett Hart from a small family company into a nationwide technology and logistics empire. Newspapers called her brilliant. Investors called her fearless. Employees called her demanding but fair. But there was one part of Victoria's life nobody knew about. 20 years earlier, before the money, before the skyscraper, before the headlines, Victoria had been a 25-year-old woman struggling to survive. Back then, she had fallen deeply in love with a young man named Matthew Bennett. They had grown up in the same neighborhood and dreamed of building a life together. Matthew had been gentle, hardworking, and fiercely protective of the people he loved. Victoria had planned to marry him. Then, one terrible night, everything changed. Matthew disappeared after driving home during a violent winter storm. His car was found near a frozen river. There was no body, only scattered belongings and a damaged wallet. Authorities eventually declared him presumed dead. Victoria never married. She buried herself in work, carrying the memory of the man she loved like a secret wound. Years passed, and she became wealthy beyond imagination, but money never filled the space his absence had left behind. Now, on an ordinary Monday morning, she opened a janitor's application. The name at the top read, Matthew Bennett. Victoria froze. Her fingers began trembling. She read the name again. Matthew Bennett. The date of birth was different from what she remembered by only a few days. The handwriting looked familiar, but it was the photograph attached to the application that shattered the last piece of doubt. Older, thinner, tired. But those eyes, those unmistakable eyes. Victoria stood so quickly that her chair rolled backward and struck the wall. She whispered his name to herself, almost afraid that saying it aloud would make the memory disappear. Then she ran out of the office. Matthew was standing near the elevators when he saw the CEO approaching. He immediately straightened his jacket, assuming he was about to be rejected. But Victoria stopped directly in front of him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Matthew looked at her face. Something stirred inside him. Not recognition exactly, but a strange familiarity he couldn't explain. Victoria asked him if they had ever met before. Matthew gave a nervous smile and said that he didn't think so. He explained that he had spent most of his adult life moving from place to place, working wherever he could. He apologized for not having impressive qualifications and said he would gladly clean bathrooms, empty trash, wash floors, or work nights if that was what the company needed. Victoria listened with tears gathering in her eyes. Then she asked him where he had grown up. Matthew named the neighborhood. Her heart nearly stopped. It was the same neighborhood where they had grown up together. Victoria asked about his parents. Matthew told her his father had passed away years ago, and his mother had died when he was young. He explained that after the accident near the river, he had survived but suffered memory problems for a long time. A truck driver had found him injured several miles away and taken him to a hospital. By the time he recovered enough to return home, everyone believed he was dead, and the life he once knew was gone. Victoria couldn't hold herself together anymore. She told him her name. Matthew stared at her. For a moment, his face went completely still. Then came the smallest whisper. "Victoria?" She nodded. The man who had forgotten pieces of his past suddenly remembered everything. The first apartment, the cheap coffee, the walks beside Lake Michigan, the promise they had made to never abandon each other, and the night they had said goodbye. Matthew's eyes filled with tears as he realized the woman standing before him was the same young woman he had loved 20 years earlier. But Victoria didn't ask why he hadn't found her. She didn't blame him. She simply stepped forward and hugged him. The billionaire CEO and the exhausted janitor applicant stood together in the middle of the corporate hallway, both crying while employees quietly watched from a distance. Later that afternoon, Matthew explained that he wasn't asking Victoria for money. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He needed a job because his daughter depended on him. That sentence changed everything. Victoria didn't give him charity. She gave him dignity. She offered him the janitorial position with full benefits. But she also arranged for him to meet a company counselor who could help him rebuild the pieces of his life he had lost. She made sure Sophie received a scholarship for school, but only after Matthew agreed that it would be structured as educational assistance rather than a handout. For the first time in years, Matthew came home carrying something more valuable than money: hope. Months passed. Matthew became one of the most respected employees in the company. He arrived early, stayed late, and treated every person, from security guards to executives, with the same kindness. Victoria and Matthew slowly rebuilt their friendship. They didn't pretend 20 years had never happened. They talked about the pain, the missed years, and the lives they had built separately. And Sophie became the unexpected bridge between them. She called Victoria Miss V at first, then eventually began calling her family. One evening, nearly a year after Matthew walked into Bennett Industries looking for a janitor job, Victoria stood at the company's annual employee celebration and looked across the room. Matthew was there with Sophie. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit. He didn't need one. He was smiling. Victoria smiled back. She realized that the greatest surprise of her life wasn't that the man she thought she had lost had returned. It was that sometimes life doesn't give you back the past exactly as it was. Sometimes it gives you a second chance to build something even more beautiful from the pieces that survived. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more emotional stories. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope today. And before we end, I have one special request. Comment second chances below if you believe that no one should be judged by their worst moment, and that kindness can change a person's entire life. Because Matthew walked into that building believing he was only applying for a janitor's job. He walked out knowing something far more powerful. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't worthless. And after 20 years of believing his life had ended that night beside a frozen river, he finally discovered that sometimes the chapter you think is the ending is only the beginning of the story you were meant to live.